the reality is 4 of the 5 top disease killers that we deal with, that people in our country are dying from, are chronic diseases. So when we talk about chronic disease, what do we mean? So
like cancers.
Yeah, long term, they're kind of ongoing, and they take years to develop, they take years to bring us to the point of potentially dying. Most of the things that we die from now are longer term diseases that develop over years and then just get progressively worse and worse and worse, affecting our quality of life throughout the process and eventually causing us to die. And 4 of the 5 top killers in the US are those types of chronic diseases. And all of those 4 have something very much in common that we're going to go into detail with tonight. So I want to start by kind of talking about the need for a paradigm shift. Think about whether you believe that the Earth revolves around the sun or the sun revolves around the Earth. Does the Earth revolve around the sun, or does the sun revolve around the Earth? Amazingly enough, 1 in 4 people in our country are not aware that we revolve around the sun. Now, number 1, that doesn't speak well for our education system, but it's understandable if you didn't know better, if you hadn't been taught. When you see the sun rise in the east and set in the west, you can believe why some people might think that the Earth or the sun revolves around the Earth. And up until hundreds of years ago, when whoever the guy was, I don't know if it was Galileo or who it was, that identified or determined that the Earth revolved around the sun, up until that time, the common perception was that the sun revolved around the Earth. And think of how mind-blowing it must have been to them when they finally found out the truth. Their paradigm had to shift. Their way of thinking had to change completely. And it was really hard for a lot of people to believe that. The reason that we bring this up is that a lot of what you're going to hear tonight and the ongoing things that we're going to teach over the course of the next 6 weeks, if you choose to participate in the program with us, are going to be similarly mind-blowing to you. You're going to have the same difficulty in accepting some of the concepts that we're going to teach as what they had hundreds and hundreds of years ago, realizing that the Earth revolved around the sun. But the same thing happens in both cases. Just like hundreds of years ago, science proved that the Earth revolved around the sun. Now, the things that you're going to learn about this evening, science has also proven. And it's disproving a lot of conventional wisdom from the medical community. The medical community has a model that's primarily based on detecting disease and then treating the disease once it's been determined that you have one. That's not a good approach to health care. That's disease management. What we teach and what this program is focused on is really focused on prevention. Helping to identify the steps that you can take early on and the ways of measuring your health at an earlier stage so that you can reduce your risk of developing those 4 out of the top 5 killers and a variety of other ones that are somewhat related. So, if there was one thing that you could do to drastically lower your risk of developing cardiovascular disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, and diabetes, if there was one thing you could do that would drastically reduce your risk of all of those, how many of you would consider doing it? The only one up here that we don't relate to that is lung disease. Because lung disease, even though it's the number 4 killer, is unrelated primarily to the topic that we're going to talk about tonight. But the other 4 all have one thing in common. And we're going to teach you enough that it will at least start to have you rethink your mind, potentially change your mindset, and hopefully consider going through the next 6 weeks with us and learning more about it so that you can take yourself to better health. But before we go down that path, I want to share a little bit about why I do this. Everybody has different reasons for doing what they do, for being in the job that they do or having the passion that they do for some aspect of life. First 25 years of my professional life, my adult life, I spent in the engineering field as an engineer and then engineering manager working in the automotive industry. I worked 8 years over at one of the maquilas over in Juarez. And I had kind of a plan for my life, and everything was going really well. very well paid, wife, 3 kids, everything was wonderful in our lives. And then we got the call that my wife had stage 3 breast cancer. And that was one of those life-altering moments that, unless you've been through it, you can't possibly understand. She was 39 years old when she found out she had stage 3 breast cancer. Now that meant that not only did she have tumor in her breast, but it was out into the rest of her system. She had a bunch of lymph nodes under her arm that were packed with cancer. They gave her a very low probability of survival regardless of what treatment approach we took. And unfortunately, she died less than 4 years later. She died shortly after she turned 43. The cancer industry looks at, if you survive 5 years from diagnosis, then that's success in their mind. You survived 5 years, you're a survivor, and that's considered a positive in their book. Now, if she'd made it a year longer and was 44 when she died, the cancer industry and the medical community would have looked at that as success. In our minds, it would have been anything but. It doesn't matter whether you're 60 and you only live 5 years longer, or 70 and only you live 5 years longer. Only a 5-year survival is not success. But that's how it's measured. Because that's, in their minds, they've done a good job if they can keep you alive for 5 years. Carmen, one of our coaches that's here this evening, is a 2-time breast cancer survivor, and it's been about 10 years, I think, since her original diagnosis. She's beaten the odds drastically, but in large part because since her second diagnosis, she hasn't been doing traditional approach to dealing with cancer. And I'm not saying that there's a right or wrong approach. Whatever approach you take is the right one for you, because you have to walk the path, and from experience, I'll never second guess anybody's path that they choose to go. But the reality is, we never saw this coming. When you're that age, you don't expect to be diagnosed with breast cancer. But we always used to think it was an old person's disease. But younger and younger people are being diagnosed with breast cancer. Younger and younger people are being diagnosed with heart disease and diabetes and Alzheimer's. It's happening earlier on, and we've got to stop it. We've got to turn it around. So that's why we do what we do. That's why I do what I do, because I don't want to see anybody go through the pain and suffering that we went through as a family. I mean, I was blessed that God brought me another wonderful woman for me to spend the rest of my life with. But my kids will never have their mom back. So I'm going to bring up Vicki at this point and let her do a little bit of the teaching.
Which is the button. Okay, so did Claudia just have the breast cancer gene? Did she just have bad genes? Is that what happened? We've all heard about the breast cancer gene, right? Actually, I learned this morning, you said she didn't.
That's right.
So, if you do have the gene, does it mean you're going to get breast cancer? No. And if you don't have the gene, clearly it doesn't mean you're not going to get it. So, whether you have the gene or not, all it means is that your odds on getting it are either increased or less. So, that said, we're going to talk about now what actually causes most of the more common cancers, like anywhere, I guess it works.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So this is a book that's been out for a few years now. It's not a kind of a book any of you are probably going to read unless you're very science-based. It's written for physicians mainly. So can I stand? I need to kind of, yeah, thank you. I just need to see that so I don't have to keep going.
That's okay.
All right, bear with me. My brain and my mouth are not connected. This is we've got 5 presentations in 48 hours and it's just all starting to jumble together. So if I say anything that totally doesn't make sense, please raise your hand and clarify. This is complete audience participation here tonight. Okay, so they used to think, and many people still do, that cancer is caused by genetic mutations, changes to the DNA, at least adult cancers, most adult cancers. But what they now know is that it's the damage to your mitochondria. Now let's think back to high school biology. What's mitochondria? Anybody remember? Mitochondria. Oh, the high school kid in the back got it. Yes. All right. Thank you. What's your name, young lady? Natalia. Yes. The powerhouse in your cells. It's the It's the energy factory that makes the energy for our cells. Every cell in our body has a mitochondria excepting red blood cells. So they used to think that it was the genetic mutations to the DNA, but now they know we cause damage to our mitochondria, which then cause the genetic mutations that then causes the cancer. In most of the cases, the cancer anyway. There's some unusual, like childhood cancers are different. So now we know that cancer cells have very few properly functioning mitochondria, or powerhouses, as Natalia just said. So how do we keep our mitochondria functioning well so that we reduce our risk of cancer? They used to think, in fact many people still think, that obesity increases your risk of cancer. And it does if you just look at that little piece. But if you dig deeper, most of what we're going to talk about tonight is digging deeper. So okay, this causes that, but what caused this? Oh, this caused that, okay, and then what caused this? So as you drill down deeper and deeper, you can find the root cause that causes the cascade of damage that then ends up with the disease. So it's not the obesity, it's not the fat, the extra fat that causes the risk of cancer. It's actually the high levels of insulin in our blood. So as you'll learn later in the presentation tonight, high levels of insulin cause us to gain weight. It's not normally the fact that we're eating too many calories. It's not usually that we're sitting on the couch and eating ice cream all day. It's usually too much insulin. Most of the clients who come to us for weight loss are exercising like maniacs and eating like birds, and yet they're still not losing weight. It's not about calories in, calories out, which is like you kind of heard in that initial video intro. So it's insulin that causes the damage to the mitochondria. A high insulin, elevated, ongoing, chronic high insulin damages our mitochondria, and the damaged mitochondria is what causes the genetic mutation, which is what causes the cancer, right? So if we drill down and stop the elevated insulin, then we stop the whole process, right? Makes sense? So cancer cells have a very different kind of metabolism. I like to speak in analogies. And so what I'm going to say is that cancer cells eat sugar. Now literally they don't have mouths, but humor me, okay? So cancer cells eat sugar. Regular cells, healthy human cells, can eat either sugar or fat. In other words, they can metabolize, they can get energy from either fat or sugar. We cannot get energy from protein. We have to turn the protein into sugar before we can get energy out of it. So healthy cells can burn either fat or sugar. It's kind of like our body is a hybrid car. Anybody have a hybrid? It can burn on gas or electric, right? So which is the cleaner fuel? Electric, yeah. So in the case of our body, the fat is the cleaner fuel. So just like gasoline burning causes more emissions, more byproducts, burning sugar for fuel, or when our body burns sugar for fuel, it causes more emissions as well. Those emissions are oxidative stress and free radical damage. So fat is the cleaner fuel. Healthy cells can burn fat. Cancer cells cannot. Cancer cells can only eat sugar. So what's another thing that helps us understand that, helps drive it home? So what we're looking at here are some different pictures of various different cancer patients. So for example, here is the CT scan of the same patient with liver cancer. Here's the PET scan. There are two different technologies. You can see the little yellow arrows pointing to the cancer in the liver here, and then over on the tongue, this is the X-ray or CT scan of the tongue. So the white is the teeth and the jawbone in the back, and then the yellow arrows on the left are pointing to the tumor. Now, in the color scan, you don't need the radiologist to stick any arrows on there showing you where the tumor is. You can just see it, right? The reason you can see that they're glowing is because before they do a PET scan, they give the patient a kind of a radioactive sugar water, if you will. And so the PET scan follows where that sugar water goes because of the radioactive stuff in it, and then the cancer cells just suck it up. Cancer cells are greedy little sugar suckers. okay? I've never said it that way before, but that's what they are. They're greedy little sugar suckers. Regular cells do not consume sugar at the rate that cancer cells do. So you can see here in the CT scan, it identified the big cancer tumor over there, but here in the PET scan, you can actually spot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 tumors here because they're all just drinking up that sugar, and so it's showing up. Up there in the top is a breast cancer patient. You can see where her tumor is. You can see where the tumor is on the patient's tongue there. Please don't chew tobacco or smoke cigars. I know you don't inhale cigars, but this patient was probably either a cigar smoker or a tobacco chewer. Okay, so MMT, and you're going to hear us use that term a lot, it stands for metabolic mitochondrial therapy. It's a way of eating. It's the way of eating that we're going to teach you to do on this program. It teaches you how to optimize your mitochondrial function so that we won't get damage and then get the change to our DNA.
I just want to make a comment related to the cancer. That's the whole idea of cancer feeding on sugar is something that, even though they use technology to determine where cancer cells are, other parts of the cancer industry don't even necessarily recognize that cancer feeds on sugar.
Mm-hmm.
Shortly after my wife was diagnosed, we went to the local Race for the Cure. We walked it, we didn't run it. But at the survivors tent, what they had for the survivors were mounds and mounds of donuts. Now, cancer feeds on sugar. She'd only been diagnosed a month, and we knew that already from the research we had done. But they're giving cancer survivors the very thing that's killing their bodies. They were feeding the cancer cells with what they had in the survivor tent. We've got to change the mindset. We've got to start to look at cancer and the other diseases we're talking about, not in terms of what drugs can we take to try to buy a few more years of our lives, but what can we do to change our lifestyle, to change our choices so that we lessen the risk and lessen the progression through our own choices.
So let me ask a question. How many of you would like to live to at least 80 years old? And let me add the caveat, in health. Okay?
In health.
In health, yes, okay? All right, so we're all on board. We want to live to be 80 or beyond in health. So I have this little magic time machine. You ready? Poof, we're all 85 now. Do you
I
still
like
feel
the
good?
way my wife looks at 85.
And the special effects.
Yes. So y'all feel good, right? We got energy, we're 85. So I want you to look at two people. Pick two people to make eye contact with. Find two people. Got your two? Everybody got two? It's important you have two. Okay. One of you probably has Alzheimer's. Which one of you is it? It's him, okay. So yes, some of you probably said, well, it's not me. You're thinking it's not me. Okay, so sadly, if it's not you, statistically speaking, you're the caregiver. So out of 3 people, 1 is a caregiver, 1 is a patient, and only 1 isn't affected by Alzheimer's at age 85. Alzheimer's disease is not just, I'm forgetting some things. I forget where I put my keys. Alzheimer's disease is putting your keys in the freezer, not just putting them on the counter and forgetting where. Alzheimer's disease is finding your keys and saying, what are these for? What do I do with these? What are these things? Alzheimer's is forgetting your memories, forgetting who you love, forgetting who loves you. Sometimes changing your personality completely. Sometimes becoming ornery and foul-mouthed and rude and obnoxious to the people who love you. It makes it really hard for them to be the caregiver. Alzheimer's is just a horrible, horrible disease. And once you have it, once the damage is done, it's irreversible. So it's a progressive disease, just like heart disease and cancer. They're progressive. They steadily get worse and worse and worse. As your Alzheimer's gets worse and worse, the damage that's done is not repairable. So let me ask a question. If you have the Alzheimer's gene, in fact, let me point out that there is actually an Alzheimer's gene. It's called the APOE4 gene. It's a very inexpensive test. I used to think I've heard this, but I used to think it was like only rich people could afford to have that test. It's like $40 through certain labs. It's a very affordable test. So why might we want to know if we have it? So we can take the steps to prevent it, not so we can fret and worry and worry ourselves into having it, but there's two things that I'm going to teach you here today that will help dramatically reduce your risk. So there were two things to reduce risk of cancer. There's two things to reduce risk of Alzheimer's. So if you happen to have the APOE4, it is rare, very few people have it, but if you do have it and you got it from one parent, you have triple the risk of getting it. If you got it from both parents, you have 10 times the risk. But that still doesn't mean that you have to get it. And it doesn't mean that if you don't have the gene that you won't get it. The Mayo Clinic did research in 2012 and compared two types of diets to prevent Alzheimer's. They compared the people who took the standard American diet. What's the initials for a standard American diet? It's a sad diet, yeah. So they fed half the group the standard American diet and half the group the diet we're going to teach you here about today. So what did they find out? Number 2 group had a 44% less Alzheimer's disease. That's like almost half. That's pretty amazing. So that way of eating, again, is called metabolic mitochondrial therapy, or MMT. So the brain images of Alzheimer's patients show the mitochondria damaged. We're back to mitochondria again. We talked about mitochondria cancer. Now we're talking about mitochondria with Alzheimer's. There is no cure, as I mentioned, but there are two things that you can do to help prevent it. So one is eat the way we're going to teach you today, and the other is to continually be learning new things. Be a lifelong learner. And I don't mean like just do crossword puzzles. Like a lot of senior centers have people do crossword puzzles. That's great, it's working your brain, but it's simply retrieving information that's already in your brain. The key to preventing it is creating new neural pathways by learning new things. So learn a new language, learn to dance, learn to play the piano, learn a new topic, pick a topic and dive in and study it like crazy. Be a lifelong learner. Those two things will make your odds of getting Alzheimer's extremely, extremely low. Okay, so what have we learned so far? Who wants to give me something from their papers that they've written down? Who had an aha moment they'd like to share?
Greedy sugar suckers.
Greedy sugar suckers, yes. I'll have to remember that one. Cancer cells are greedy.
I didn't know that about the cells lighting up with the dye
Yes.
because of the sugar.
Because of the sugar, yeah. Yeah, thank you. Who else has something to share?
I like the statement that was made that finding the disease is not taking care of the disease or managing the disease. That's not health care, that's disease management.
Management, yes. Yeah, so true. So what we're teaching here today is truly helping you prevent diseases. I can't diagnose, treat, or cure. I'm not a doctor. We leave that to them. I educate so you can reduce your risk of having things.
Alzheimer's is not reversible,
Yep,
only increases. It has no cure,
yep.
and there's no drug to prevent it, only learning new things.
And keeping your sugar down. Alzheimer's starts early on. Just like Bob talked about, cancer starts decades ahead. Alzheimer's starts in your 40s. Things start to happen. So you want to prevent it now. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, and on both two diseases or conditions, mitochondria
Are involved.
Are involved, yeah.
Damaged mitochondria are the cause. Yes, exactly. We're going to learn a lot about mitochondria in this program.